Hello and welcome to Must Read TV, the Skylark Bookshop Virtual Author Series. My name is Alex George and I am the owner of Skylark Bookshop, which is an independent bookstore in downtown Columbia, Missouri. Before we get started, a quick reminder that this is a busy week at Skylark. Tomorrow night we'll be celebrating the launch of Nina Furstenau's wonderful new book, Green Chili and Other Imposters. And on Thursday, we'll be gathering for the second edition of the Skylarking Book Club. We will be discussing The Hive by Melissa Scholes-Young, who will be joining us via Zoom to answer your questions. And do always keep checking back on the events page because we are always adding new things. This evening, it is my huge pleasure to welcome back to Skylark Katherine May, New York Times bestselling author of Wintering, to celebrate the US launch of her wonderful new book, The Electricity of Every Living Thing, which is published today. Katherine and I last talked in last December, about Wintering, and it remains my favorite author interview, and it is by far our most watched online event. As you may already know or are about to discover, Katherine is a fellow Brit, but unlike me, she lives in the UK, which means that she has stayed up very late to talk with us this evening, and for that we are very grateful. For those of you who haven't met her before, Katherine is a writer of both fiction and nonfiction. Her journalism and essays have appeared in a range of publications, including the New York Times, The Observer, and LitHub. That list has changed, by the way, since the last time I did this introduction.
I got that. Yeah, that's not even in my bios.
Oh, it's all. She lives by the sea in Whitstable, England, with her husband, son, 3 cats, and a dog. And then, as you're about to discover, an avid lover of the outdoors. She also is the host of the Wintering Sessions podcast, which, as an avid consumer of podcasts, I wholeheartedly recommend. If you enjoy this evening's conversation, please do consider buying a copy of Katherine's book, or indeed of both of Katherine's books, from Skylark. You can do that either by going to our e-commerce site. It's right on the front page if you go there, or you can give us a call at 573-777-6990, or shoot us an email at mail@skylarkbookshop.com, and we will take care of you. If you've got a question for Katherine, please write it in the Q&A box or the chat box. Normally I say, or if you're watching on Facebook, stick it in the comments, but I'm going solo tonight and I'm not going to be able to check Facebook as well. So sorry, if you're watching on Facebook, you might want to go over to Zoom instead, because it'll be easier for you to get your questions answered. And I will do my best to get to those towards the end of the conversation. All right, introductions over with. Katherine, it's great to see you. Thank you again for staying up late, and thank you for writing this wonderful, wonderful book, which I just adored. And I think probably a good place to begin would be if you would read the 4 paragraphs on pages 5 and 6 about the Southwest Path coast.
So the Southwest Coast Path is a difficult, craggy and bloody-minded walking route that hugs the coastline between Minehead in Somerset and Poole Harbour in Dorset, taking in the seaboards of North and South Devon and the entire perimeter of Cornwall along the way. I call it bloody-minded because it exhibits a willful refusal to provide any kind of shortcut, even where it's obvious that any sane person would take one. Walkers routinely find themselves climbing perilously down into a cove, only to make a steep ascent immediately afterwards, and often with a far more sensible level path in full sight. Such is the brutal glory of the Southwest Coast Path. For its entire 630 miles, it clings as close to this island's crinkled edge as possible. So close, in fact, that chunks of it regularly fall into the sea. There are moments when it feels as though it was designed with mountain goats in mind, rather than humans. Its original users, before the path had a name and a nifty set of acorn-embossed waymarkers, were coastguards, who created a series of routes that allowed them to check for smugglers in isolated coves. This perhaps justifies the exhausting pattern of rise and fall, but I detect something more in its design too. there is a kind of landscape geekery embedded in the Southwest Coast Path. Whenever I walk it, I get the sense that someone else understands my urge to know the full extent of my world, to trace its boundaries with my feet, to take the longest, hardest way around. It may not be obvious from what I've said so far, but I adore the Southwest Coast Path. I crave it, particularly the stretch between Bantham and Start Point in the South Hams of Devon. It's seen my best of times and worst of times. I've kicked back in Devon at the most triumphant moments of my life and scuttled down there in terror when my life was in shreds. It always seems to replenish me.
It's so wonderful. It's so wonderful. I don't know the path myself, but I've been to Devon and Cornwall, and I want to go back now, of course, and sort of do some of this for myself.
I constantly miss it.
Yeah, I'm sure. So you say somewhere else in the book, so there's a real pleasure in learning the lie of the land through the soles of your shoes, which is so true. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about how and why walking is so important to you.
Well, do you know what? I don't think walking was anything like as important to me until I undertook the project in this book, really. I decided, essentially, I was sort of just approaching 39, and I decided that I wanted to walk the Southwest Coast Path before I turned 40. And I, like I had at the time my son was 3, I knew I couldn't go off and commit 6 weeks to it, or, do the kind of heroic, great big walk that maybe normally makes a book like this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of chunked it up, and I thought, okay, well, if I do the maths on this, I can do 25 miles a month and just keep coming back. And of course, that was just an insane plan, particularly as winter was approaching at the time. And, later someone said to me, you do know that no one walks the Southwest Coast Path in winter. And I was like, no, I didn't actually. I didn't realize that, but I am more than aware of why you wouldn't, because the weather was so hard to get through. But despite that, I learned in that process that my kind of instinct that walking was something I needed to do was absolutely right, and that it does so many things, I think. And one of them is that it tires you out enough to rest your mind for a while. But there was this other thing about understanding the shape of the land around me and exploring that place I loved and really going to its furthest reaches. And you get it's really hard to articulate in lots of ways, but you get a different paced understanding of the places you already know when you walk between them instead of drive between them. And that is, you go through all the bits that don't have names and that don't have parking locations, and that nobody else has really been to. And you just get this intimacy, which is, it's absolutely unbeatable, I think.
Yeah, that the intimacy thing is right. And you're right. It's not just, it's also with sort of running, because I'm a runner and I run up and down the same trail all the time. And every so often I get to walk the dog, and it's an entirely different experience. And you're suddenly, you get, not that I run very quickly, but I walk even more slowly than I run. And you suddenly see things that when you're running, I'm just basically trying to stay upright at that point. So there is that, and that intimacy and that engagement with your surroundings, which is so true, and that makes a lot of sense. I also wanted to ask you about, you wrote at one point something that really interested me. And you sort of touched on this a little bit. So you said, for the first few hours of a long walk, I'm brimming with new ideas and insights. And after that, everything falls blissfully quiet and I am empty. And in that wide open space, mountains can move.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in that wide open space that you create and that empty. So what happens there?
Do you know what? I think there's something, I did just touch on it, in that there's something about exhaustion that, I don't know if it's literally low glycogen levels. I certainly suffered from those enough times. But there was a point there was a definite process that I would walk through that I began to really notice that, you know, like the first hour was all about kind of discomfort really and frustration, you know, like I wouldn't be walking fast enough, my boots would feel uncomfortable, like everything would feel slightly wrong, and I'd be like, why am I doing this? I'm gonna have to give up. And then I would go through a very distinct phase when I felt kind of euphoric almost, and my brain was like buzzing and popping with ideas, and it was like popcorn brain is how I describe it. But then you know, you only get this in a very, very long walk. You move into this phase where you've gone past language, almost like your brain hasn't got anything to say for itself anymore. And like the time just passes, then you don't really, it's like you're not really a person, you know, you're not, like your ego has gone, I think. And although it feels like nothing's happening in that space, those were definitely the moments afterwards where I felt like revelations had happened. And I was speaking about it to someone the other day, and they said, oh, it's very similar to meditation. And I think it is, but it's almost like a mechanical way of getting to it. You know, like you can sit down and you can make an effort to get towards that place, or you can just move your legs for long enough, and eventually that space happens somehow.
I was about to say it sounds very much like meditation, and again, not to go on about the running, but I can't meditate. I mean, I've tried,
right.
My brain is just, I was going, why am I doing this? This is silly. But when I run, I have the same thing, and I'll get to the end of a run and sort of look around and go, oh, well, you know, and
right.
there is an emptiness there, which is kind of blissful.
So a stillness,
and so then, but what you're saying is, so then the in terms of the moving, the mountains moving, so then do ideas come into that space then once it's emptied out?
I mean, ideas, I mean, that feels too concrete in a way. It's almost like you've kind of got to this kind of essence of being. That sounds really grand. And yeah, I mean, an idea would be a too conceptual a construct for that space. But I think in a way, it's more that I could see things that I couldn't see before, like space had been cleared in front of my perception. And I don't think I'd ever have got to the revelation that's central to this book without that space, like without working my way towards it.
Wow, that's very cool. There's a great book called Daily Habits. I don't know whether you've seen it, and it's basically someone collected the daily habits of a ton of people. They were like composers and writers and all sorts of people, and just about everybody walks.
Yeah,
it's like it's a fundamental component of, it seems to me, of the creative timetable almost. And like people, you know, whoever it is, like will compose a symphony in the morning and then go off for a walk in the afternoon. And there are very few pieces in that book where people don't walk. And
so
I do think that there's something about walking in particular that so for example, I find that if I have a plot point that I'm trying to sort of untangle, the only way I can do it is if I walk.
Interesting.
You can't sort of, I used to sort of mowing the lawn, and people would say, oh, do you get lots of ideas when you mow the lawn? I go, no, I'm thinking about mowing the lawn. But that's really interesting. But walking is just the right walking. Yeah, it's like, well, there's the physical dimension. There's you need to think, you don't need to think too much about anything, which allows that sort of space to come in. So it's kind of metronomic, I think, as well. There's like a tick, tick, tick. And I can't solve problems by thinking about them directly. So I need to get past that point where I'm trying to problem solve, because that's always like my most rubbish ideas. So I guess walking does that. I mean, Charles Dickens walked 21 miles a day, didn't he? Which I did he? I find 21. Where did he have the time to write all those bloody? I can't imagine. But I guess everyone was doing stuff for him. You know, he probably had a house full of servants, didn't he? Like, he wasn't doing all the nonsense we have to do. He wasn't putting the bins out. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, and I think that, but what you were saying about like addressing things head on can be difficult sometimes. And when you walk, it's like you're looking, you're just looking at things slightly at an angle, because you're
Yeah.
not really focusing on it. You're actually focusing on where you're going, and that allows that the inhibitions come down, and that then you can sort of maybe thoughts will come in that wouldn't have come in otherwise.
It's all true.
Yeah, so you talk about in that little piece that you read, the sort of 630 miles and how awful some of it is and how difficult some of it is. And it seemed that part of the point of the project was the slog, right? And the determination to complete what you had started. And you wrote, the aim of this is to bring about tiny manageable moments of crisis in our lives so that we're ready when the inundations come again. Which I thought was really interesting. And there are lots of moments of crisis, all of which are very well managed in the book. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that idea, about what you were trying to do there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I was consciously doing it. I like when I went into it, I think I was thinking about going somewhere beautiful. And really quickly, because I started in September, and so by my third walk, it was no longer picturesque. It was just pounding me with rain, mainly. And I carried on because I felt like I'd committed to it. In fact, part of the reason I carried on was because I was working at a university, and they'd given me a small grant to help me to pay for the travel. And I thought, well, I can't. I've got to do it now. I've got to spend that money. Like, I can't give it back. So I kept pounding on, and it was only later that I realized that I'd kind of staged a false crisis in a way. Like, I'd created like in narrative terms, I'd created a sort of moment of conflict, really, by forcing us all into this weird pattern where we were like driving 6 hours down to Devon, and I was walking, and I was like not ever achieving what I needed to do, and I was coming back exhausted, and everyone was kind of facilitating me. And I kind of thought there was a utility to that, because that was like a safe crisis in lots of ways. It was inconvenient and unpleasant in lots of ways, but it was also, it was not, anyone getting ill, as had happened to me loads of times in my life, or a divorce, or like all of the kind of really terrible things that could have happened. And so I now, like, looking back over it, think I would do that again. Like, if I was in that kind of quandary where I didn't know what to do next, I couldn't figure it out, I would do something wild, because why not? Like, how much worse can it get sometimes?
Right. So interesting. It's a little bit like what we're talking about walking and sort of not paying attention, and that insight comes in, and if you create this thing, then maybe that's so interesting. Try that.
Just do an enormous thing, like a grand gesture.
So another, and I'm conscious I've got so much I want to ask you, so I'm going to skip over a few questions here. But one of the really interesting bits of the book, it's all wonderful, but you say, imagine for a moment that land isn't divided up into areas, but into paths through. And you talk about how we exist in the world in a physical sense, and we move through it from one place to another, which kind of reminded me of when I lived in London. And I sort of realized that I didn't really know the city at all. What I actually knew was a series of journeys, by route master bus, from my flat to the office, from my flat to Highbury or to Tate Modern or Soho, or whatever it was. And there were these strings that would go across the map. And that was really all I knew. And this was brought home during the pandemic, when the shop was shut for several months, and we used to get into our cars at the end of every day and deliver books around town. And I suddenly discovered all of these places in Colombia. I've lived here for 18 years. I had no idea that they existed before. And
interesting.
Yeah, and to me, it felt a little bit sad and a little bit limiting. But in the book, you take this idea and you turn it of journeys, and you turn it into something really beautiful. And you say that we create paths, and your path is made of meaning. And I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about that and how we learn these paths and where that beauty comes from, and also how that corresponds or connects with the Aboriginal sense of territory?
Yeah, so I mean that, you know, it does derive from a much more ancient understanding of land, which we've totally lost, because nowadays we're very concerned with drawing a circle around land and owning the land within it, and kind of possessing it. And that is not how it has always operated. You know, in so many different societies, the way that we traveled through land was what we owned. And so we kind of owned a route, and that route was about meanings to us. You know, it was a journey we took between places of significance. And as I undertook my walk, I was reformulating my understanding of the land around me, and I started to walk in my local area too, and started to kind of join the paths between places I knew in a way that, yeah, I didn't know those routes. Like I knew A and B, but I didn't know this route from A to B. And do you know what, I'm so disinterested in land ownership in the wake of that. I was trying to figure something out, really, which was about my own need for like repetition and comfort and returning to things again and again, rather than always seeking newness. And, you know, when we talk about autism, like that's often spoken about in a very critical way, like, oh, you know, they know. I've got noise coming from it. Have you got that too? That's right. Maybe good. Sorry. But instead, I wanted to think about it as like this kind of wonderful seeking of familiarity and this deepening knowledge and deepening knowing of our places. And yeah, it's a way of valuing myself as well as the places I know, I think.
Yeah, it's such a radical concept, you know, and you know, so particularly, you know, where you live and where I live, and you know, property, and what's an Englishman's house is his castle. I mean, it's so, and from an early age, like this is what we're taught, and it's interesting because it's different. Yeah. I'm going off topic here, but you know, in Paris, nobody owns anything. Everybody rents. And it's just really interesting how in particular societies ownership like that is much more important. But well, you mentioned the autism, so I'm going to move and improvise here and go on to a different topic. So your Twitter bio, and by the way, everyone watching, if you don't follow Katherine on Twitter, you absolutely should, because it's always extremely entertaining. But the Twitter bio, you say, I think the first words are brackish human, which I loved. And you tell a story in the book. So a friend of yours said to you, well, of course, people find you a bit marmity, which made me laugh out loud.
In an English way.
Yeah, and then please send you a tweet expressing some surprise that your US editor allowed that one to get through. So I wonder if I've said this is a two-part question, really. First of all, can you please explain to people who don't know what marmity means in general? Yes. And then B, how your friend thought that it applied to you.
So marmity, I mean, the phrase marmity comes from a very famous advert that we had like quite a long time ago now. I mean, it must have been while you were still in the UK, presumably. Yeah, so it's a long time ago, which was like founded around Marmite, you either love it or hate it. And given that we Brits are obsessed with our favourite yeast extract paste that we love to have on our toast, and which Americans don't understand at all, I've got a theory about this, incidentally. I think that Americans don't like Marmite because it doesn't go with coffee. It only goes with tea.
Oh, quite possibly. That's so interesting. Brilliant.
You need to drink it with a cup of tea. Anyway, that's by the by. Okay. So Marmite has like entered our language as a phrase for like it's something that divides people. And so yes, there was kind of a key point in my book where I'd just, you know, chatted to a friend and they'd said that I'm marmitey. And they said it to me as if like it was something that I deliberately courted, almost, that I was like trying to be marmite. And honestly, it kind of came as a surprise to me, because like one of the things that I guess repeats through the book is that I feel like I'm the person trying the hardest in the room to fit in, and I'm sticking out like a sore thumb whatever I do. Like the harder I try to fit in, the worse it seems to make it. And it, if I stay quiet, that's weird. If I talk too much. Like nothing's right. And so yeah, it became a phrase that I associated with myself. But actually, like, that's ultimately become good for me, I think, because I mean, I love Marmite. I'm a Marmite lover. And the people who love me really do adore me. And I'm really grateful for that. Like, I think ultimately maybe she's right. Maybe I do want to be Marmite. Maybe I'm not interested in like the people who are indifferent. And I am very, very grateful for the people that stick by me, because like, yeah, Marmite, it's a good thing, particularly with tea.
See, I don't drink tea, which people are often very I know, very disappointed by when I tell them that. I say, no, I just drink coffee. So yeah, and you talk about that. It's so interesting. You tell this lovely story in the book. I don't know if lovely is the right word, but it didn't leave me, about, and it's a wonderful illustration of that sort of disconnection that you're talking about. So you were at what was it? You were attending a training course, and there was an after lunch show and tell about weddings. And somebody brought along an order of service from their wedding, and somebody else brought a garter, and then you brought out your wedding dress, which sort of, and you describe it, so it was so sort of kind of excruciating to and people sort of passing it around, and I'm quite sure what to, and you understood immediately by looking at everyone's faces that you had messed up. And you say, so, and I'm just going to read this. So there was some fine-grained implication in the instructions to keep it light, and I missed it. And I know it must have been there because everyone else picked up. But as you said before about you're the one trying the hardest, I mean, you also talk about yourself being a mimic. And even if you didn't quite understand the rules, you sort of learned to appear the same as everybody else, or do your best to appear the same as everybody else, and your best to conform with the expectations, even if sometimes that was very difficult for you. And then the book begins by with this moment when you're driving, I think in the rain, late at night, and you're listening to the radio. I'm guessing it was Radio 4.
Radio 4, you know it, yep.
And you sort of have this light bulb moment. So could you explain to people what it was you heard and what that light bulb moment was?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to sound really insignificant, but I was driving towards an optician's appointment and listening, like, as you know, you listen to Radio 4 just in general, don't you? And whatever comes on, is going to be good, except for the Archers. And
never understood the Archers.
No, don't get it. No. That's going to baffle everyone as much as Marmite now, isn't it? Anyway, so I'm driving along, and an interview came on with a woman of about my age talking about her experience of being autistic. And, the first thing that struck me was that I'd never actually heard a woman talking about being autistic before, like from a kind of internal perspective. And, psychology was part of my degree. I'd studied autism. I'd taught a long time. I'd worked with autistic kids. I felt like I really knew what this thing was. And I realized in that moment, not only that I hadn't understood it before, but that it was absolutely me. And I had this, unquestioning recognition and this feeling that it was the first time I'd ever heard it, and first time I'd ever had the opportunity to make sense of my responses to so much in my life. And it was, as you say, it was a real light bulb moment. There was no kind of grey area with it. There was just this utter sense of clarity.
That's so interesting. And so at the end of the book, so just to literally bookend it, at the end of the book, you have this brief sort of epilogue where a doctor gives you, I guess, a sort of formal diagnosis,
Yeah.
and confirming that. So my first question is, which is just to go to, is how long was it between the Radio 4 program and that diagnosis?
Oh, ages. And actually, that was only, so the bit that's recorded in the book is like the first kind of hurdle you have to get over in order to go for a diagnosis. So it took so long, but like, by the time the book was due to be published, that's as far as I got. But you have like an initial assessment with a psychiatrist who agrees that you might be a candidate for more formal assessment, which that I then went on to take afterwards. And that, I mean, from seeing my GP, like it took me sort of, I don't know, like 4 or 5 months to get the courage up to go and see my GP, because I just couldn't think what to say, you know, like how do you go in and phrase that? And it led to quite an extraordinary conversation with him. But then after that, I got put on a waiting list. And in fact, on the NHS waiting list, I've never heard back from the clinic. Like it's 6 years on now, or 5 years on. Because there are so many women now understanding that they're autistic and seeking diagnosis. And that the NHS has, the last time I checked, had like one specialist clinic for women in the whole country. And, you know, I waited forever. And there was a point when I chased and they said, we haven't even got a waiting list at the moment. The waiting list is full. You know, you can't even get onto that. And so I was really lucky that I had a kind of small health insurance policy that I used to go private. But that it took, you know, after I'd waited well over a year on the NHS and hadn't even got onto the waiting list to wait for the actual appointment, I moved on myself. So yeah.
Okay. Wow, that's
Yeah.
that's a sobering little story. So when you received that diagnosis, you know, the doctor says, "So what do you want?" And you say, "I don't want anything.
Nothing."
You didn't want treatment. You didn't want medication." So the obvious question, I guess, is, what did that diagnosis? What did you feel when you got it? What did it mean to you?
It's a question of identity, and it's a question of being able to not even assert to other people, but to understand what you are. And, you know, like autism is different to other conditions that you might see a psychiatrist for, in that there is no cure, there is no medication. And overwhelmingly, whenever autistic people are surveyed, they say they don't want that anyway. What we all want is a better way to cope, and we want some signposts. And for lots of people like me, just knowing is enough to make huge changes in your life and to sort of reorient yourself towards meeting your own needs, perhaps for the first time in your life. And it's vast, and the changes are tiny, you know. I mean, they really, you know, I live a quieter life now, and I don't go to things that I know will make me distressed and uncomfortable. And I tell people when I am feeling distressed and uncomfortable, and that pretty much does it, you know. I've stopped trying to force myself into close the itch. I mean, that's tiny, right? You'd think I'd have done that anyway, but I didn't, because I felt like the clothes shouldn't itch. It's so insidious, this message that you should be one thing, and that you should be comfortable in certain situations that you see everybody else not just being comfortable in, but being happy in and rejoicing in them. And you constantly don't fit. And so you force yourself into all of these ill-fitting clothes, like literally and metaphorically.
Right.
And diagnosis hopefully gives you permission to just stop doing the stuff that's making you miserable.
Right.
It's crazy how simple that is, isn't it?
Wow. I mean, but often the most fundamental things are simple, aren't they? It's that permission structure, I can see, would be absolutely life-changing, particularly if you're beating yourself up all the time, or you were beating yourself up all the time, and wondering why is this a problem? Why am I doing this?
Yeah, totally. And like that's like, I'm quite a rebellious person. Like, I've never been someone that's particularly trying to be normal or conform to the kind of mainstream. And even with all of that, like, I was constantly making myself excruciatingly uncomfortable, and permission was granted to stop doing it. Yeah.
That's so interesting. And I liked what you said about the whole sort of process of diagnosis, or no, let me rephrase, the purpose of the diagnosis. And you say the whole diagnostic thrust lies in placing a person on a neat medical shelf rather than engaging with their experiences and difficulties. And you talk about finding a blog where people with Asperger's syndrome they post, and I guess they are talking about what the diagnosis means to them.
Yes.
Rather than, as you put it in the book, providing comfort to the people on the outside who have to deal with them. And it's turning the whole thing back to front, which was so interesting to me to read that.
No, absolutely. And that's kind of, I mean, actually, you know, lots changed since I wrote the book, because the book came out in the UK a couple of years ago now. And so, like, autism is one of the things that's moving on more quickly than most other sort of medical or psychological conditions. And what we are beginning to move towards more is the opportunity for people to self-identify and to do that with the support of the community as well. But when I was going through it, there wasn't enough out there to really truly self-identify. Like, the information was very hard to find, which is exactly one of the reasons I wrote the book. But I'm really supportive of this movement towards, you know, particularly adults, and particularly people like me who don't want anything, you know, like, we're not asking to be signed off anything or to access anything in particular. We just want the pleasure of being able, the pleasure is the wrong word, but we want the utility of being able to live as we need to do. And I think being able to work with other autistic people to identify your autism would be the most valuable thing you could do, because that's that understanding from the inside, rather than like, oh, you're doing this and so therefore I believe you. It's like, you know, when you're diagnosing adult women, you have to trust what they're saying, because we are so masked and so camouflaged that we don't know how to show you that we're autistic. We buried that a long time ago.
Right. Yeah. You know, and I was also struck, he was to talk about, it's interesting to hear how things have moved along since the book was published. And, you know, you tell a story about telling somebody about your diagnosis, and the response was, oh, well, I'm sorry to hear that. Which made you understandably furious. So can we talk about stigma for a little bit? And you know, you said we should not, I feel, commiserate with people for mere difference. And then somewhere else you wrote, I don't want a cure for being myself, which I particularly love. And so can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, was that part of the reason for writing the book? I mean, I think it was just to normalize it a little bit, and just to get people thinking about it in a different way.
Definitely. And actually, I mean, stigma is something I still struggle with quite often, and it comes up. I mean, I am like a very camouflaged autistic person, and so I go out into the world, and most of the time people don't realize I'm autistic. And that means that, you know, I can, you know, go into shops or whatever and pass. But I've really noticed very strongly that in the moments when I don't manage to pass, like when something goes wrong, or when I tell people I'm autistic because I think it will be useful for them to know, 9 times out of 10, the tone of the conversation shifts immediately. And like, sometimes you get the sing-songy voice, like, oh, okay, then no problem. And I hate that. But other times people are kind of angry with you, and you feel this shift in prejudice just land on you, like this kind of fury drops in. And it's really interesting to talk to other masked autistic people who say the same, because you kind of think, oh, is that just me? And I'm still having these weird encounters all the time, and it's still not that's safe for me to tell people I'm autistic, and that's a privilege because some people can't cover it up. But
Sure. No,
it's
for sure.
yeah.
So where
But
does
sorry,
go ahead.
no, it's really hard to place these things. I had a really strange encounter on Friday at a sort of day course that I went to, where I was chatting to a perfectly nice woman, and she started to recommend a podcast to me, and then said, well, I mean, it's fantastic, but she's openly autistic. So, and I was like, I'm going to stop you there because I need you to know before you say anything else that I'm autistic too, because I don't want to hear whatever that so is going to lead to. And I mean, obviously, like, you know, she was like, felt awkward about it. And I don't think she meant anything by it. But of course, I get to see people's conversational habits around the stuff that they'd rather I didn't hear if they knew what I was. And it's, yeah, we as a society are in some pretty bad habits around autism.
Yeah. Wow. Where do you think that, I'm just so intrigued by and slightly horrified by this, the fury. Where do you think the fury comes from? Just being wrong-footed or embarrassed or just not knowing,
no,
it's the absence of knowing how to
superiority. It's superiority.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and the fury comes from all sorts of different places, but I think there is a sense in the society we live in right now that we are in competition for scarce resources. And anyone who, you know, makes any claim on having a need is immediately a threat to people who already feel they haven't got enough, you know, and I feel compassion for that. But we are being misdirected to being angry towards people who we think are weaker than us, rather than saying, how can I be part of a system where we all feel okay and supported? You know, and again, my needs are often so tiny. I'm not asking for anything from most people, other than sometimes like I need to step out the door for a minute so it's less noisy. You know, it's tiny. Yeah.
Wow. So one of the things that I loved was you say that the Maori have recently developed new words to address modern day problems, yes, which their ancient lexicon never had to deal with. And their word for autism is taki. I knew that was going to happen. Taki watanga.
So glad you did that rather than me.
you know, my mother is a New Zealander. She was born and raised there, so I should be able to do better with this. Anyway, taki watanga, which means, and I love this, in your own time and space. And you obviously really responded strongly.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you talk about what your time and space is and what?
Yeah, and it's really interesting just to note that links slightly to the kind of Western word autism, but autism was actually originally meant as a bit of an insult. It's like it almost kind of means solipsistic or kind of self-obsessed or self-absorbed. Whereas like in your own time and space just shifts that again to that subjective understanding rather than the objective appearance. And yeah, that is, yeah, it's that kind of turning of the tables, which is what I love so much about it. Yeah. But you know, to me, that is a lot of, that captures a lot of my experience of what it's like to be me, which is that I'm seeking my own kind of zone really quite often. Like I need to retreat into it. It's not a kind of choice. It's a pull and a need, and you know, I suffer if I don't get to do that. But also the kind of the use of time and space is really interesting, because I think we talk about autistic time within the community, and we talk about how we perceive time quite differently. I think it's definitely not, I mean, you know, this will make you giggle, having turned up very, very late to the last time we were supposed to talk online. But
wasn't going to mention it.
we have real problems, you know, with things like calendars and timings, but also there's a sense that time isn't linear for many of us, that kind of progression doesn't make sense, and that we work in kind of much more circular kind of, yes, and that relates beautifully to the seasons for me. But that kind of perception of the basic units of being are different in a way that we haven't fully articulated yet, and which certainly isn't part of the diagnostic process. but there's a quality to our experience that is, that's shifted.
That's really, really interesting. Well, I've got my eye on the time. I've got so much else to talk about. I want to ask you one more thing though, about on this subject, which is the title, The Electricity of Every Living Thing. And I wonder if you could just explain the title.
Yeah. So like it's clearly a theme, but it's another kind of flipping of the difficult parts of autism into the positive parts. The electricity that I refer to is actually quite literal for me. Like when a person touches me, I feel an electric shock, and I will literally feel a kind of burn on my skin for a few hours afterwards. Like it's that powerful.
Oof, I didn't realize it was for that long. Okay.
Yeah. It's really, like, touch is such a huge issue for me, and it's got such different implications for me than it has for other people. So I was first talking about that buzz, that kind of energy that I get. But I began to think about the ways in which that electricity is really positive as well, and the way that it's so highly tuned and highly sensitive that it lets me perceive life in things that I don't think other people really read. I do feel a kind of buzz off of so many things in this world, and a tingle, and that's actually very, very lovely. Like I feel an interrelatedness and an interconnectedness that seems so invisible in so much the way we talk in everyday life, that I assume that other people don't perceive it, but it's there for me all the time.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I love that. So I wanted to talk about parenthood too.
Yes. Yeah.
For obvious reasons. So a lot of this book is about being a parent. But what is different about this book is that you're really honest about the fact that sometimes being a parent can be a bit shit.
Yes.
And funnily enough, it reminded me when I was living in London, I was in a writers group with, weirdly, a bunch of American women. And my fourth novel was sort of touched on this. The wife in the novel really hated being a mother, and all of these women said to me, "You can't write that. You can't possibly put that in a novel." And it was like, this is like you just like don't go there. It's like the third one. You cannot talk about this, because everybody has to pretend all the time that it's all one.
Fantastic.
But when and you say early on, there was an invisible barrier between what I intended to achieve and what I was able to do in practice. And I thought, there are going to be people reading this book and they're all going to go, yes, but you know what though? They're going to do it under their breath. Because they're no one's actually allowed to sort of admit this. And you talk about going for a walk, and I think you got lost, but you didn't. It was fine, and you actually felt fantastic because you knew that your son was being looked after and was safe. And then you wrote, and that was the moment I realized that as the mother of a young child, the world was never going to give me permission to be on my own, but that I needed it anyway. And that honesty was something that just a lot of people don't appear to be capable of.
And I like, why is that? I mean, that's this is a very autistic perspective, because we say what we think, but I don't understand why we can't trust women to hold both of those positions at once, to like love our child and like it must be clear the sacrifices we're continually making and are totally willing to make. And I don't think anyone could come out of reading that book without absolutely knowing that I would throw myself under a bus for my son. God. But at the same time, like, why can't we express ambivalence? Because we're complex human beings. I don't understand why it continues to surprise us, and it does, and I don't get it.
It's really weird. And I mean, my son is 20 now, so it's been a long time since I was pushing him around in a baby carriage. But there are so many expectations, obviously much more of mothers than of fathers, which again, what's that about? But we can sort of push past that, I think.
Yeah.
So I was curious whether you've got any pushback though from that kind of that honest perspective, and whether people have sort of written you angry emails or
do you know
tweets.
what? Surprisingly little.
Oh, good.
Yeah, surprisingly little. I mean, as you say, people often want to express their approval quietly, but it was really early on that I realized that it was landing, because I signed to my agent like with this book, and she was just like, the bits about motherhood just made me jump for joy, because she was going through the same stuff, and I honestly feel like it's uncontroversial, and I maybe it's about the circles that it works in, because maybe the people that are doing unicorns and buttercups are not the people that are going to pick my book up. And I'm really fine with that separation, like like they are really welcome to avoid me, but actually I was really braced for stuff about that, and I've had surprisingly little. Maybe just not enough people have read it yet, though. Maybe that's coming.
Well, I hope not. I mean, I think it was, you beautifully managed to capture as you say, we're complex creatures, and it's the most complex relationship between a parent and a child. And
massive, so much push and pull there, always.
And
like to try and hide that is just ridiculous, I think.
I couldn't agree with you more. And maybe my favorite line in the whole book, and that's a very high bar, is this one where you come back from a weekend walking and you say, a weekend in the wild is one thing, but catching bedtime is an entirely different kind of wonder. And you're right, there are so many gorgeous moments and touching moments of real intimacy in this book with you and your son, and he's such a character. It's just it's so beautiful, and I could just so relate to like the spilling everything, and I loved it all. It was great. So we've got a question from Christina, and I'm just, so forgive me if I just read this out to you. She says, my son, he is on the spectrum. Do you have advice on getting into writing and overcoming the obstacles that he may face when attempting to get into writing and the publishing world? He's almost 10 and wants to be an editor and study journalism when he is older.
Oh, wow. Oh, how interesting. I mean, actually, the advice is really simple, which is just to let him do his autistic thing and flow into writing. I mean, we have brains that drive us towards the things we're fascinated by, and like a lot of the traditional advice has been to stop us from doing that and to make us kind of balance out, but that's the wrong way around. Like, let him drive himself towards writing for as much as he wants to, and then those professional qualifications are totally within his reach. I was leading a university degree until very recently. We had several autistic kids studying with us, and we worked hard to support them the best we could, and they succeeded incredibly well. So he's in a better position to become a writer than most other people, if you ask me, because I know how many writers are on the spectrum too, and maybe aren't as out about it as I am, but we are all over the industry.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you. That's a great answer. So there's so much wisdom in this book. One of the things I loved, you talk about watching 3 seals frolic in the water, and you say, you're describing you and your walking companion. We aren't speechless exactly, but our vocabulary is so drenched in fascination that we only have a few words left. Look, wow, look, oh. And we scrabble around for a shared language of wonder. And I just thought that was so lovely and so smart, if also a tiny bit sad. And then elsewhere you say, and you'll see where I'm going with this, we are losing the ability to name ordinary things. And the idea there being, I guess, that if it's not exotic, then we're no longer interested. And yet there's so much wonder as you illustrate, just on our doorstep, whether it's the bird song in the back garden or the crash of the waves on the Cornish rocks. Can you talk maybe just as, well, we're not quite done, but can you talk about how we might think about rebuilding our relationship with our own wildlife and how we can recapture that language of wonder?
Do you know what? It's something that I'm personally working on all the time, actually, because I grew up without that language, and I grew up without those skills in my environment, you know, to identify things and to name individual plants and to have a sense of what their properties are and when they come out, and, you know, like all of those things. And they are all about detail, which is something that my brain craves, actually, like to sink down into levels of detail. And they're a way of keeping our brain agile too, because as we walk through the landscape, if we can name things, we're constantly rehearsing that information and we're finding the gaps in our knowledge, which we can then go and research. It's like such a healthy thing to do. And I just think it's a project, and it's time for us to start becoming students of the stuff we've lost. And like, I'm working on mushrooms at the moment. That's my thing. I'm making it my mission to, you know, just be able to identify the ones I can eat and to know the ones that are going to kill me. Like, I think that's handy.
Sounds like a good idea. Yeah.
And where to find them. And so I've been working on it really hard this year, and I've got a stack of books and I've been on a course, and but I'm also talking to people who are already mushroom hunters, and they come from all sorts of other communities. So I'm like being helped out by a Finnish woman and by a Polish woman, and by someone who used to be married to an Italian man. And so they all have like knowledge from different angles. And that's cultural knowledge that we have lost. And so we like need to recover it from around us. And like, maybe the British never did have that cultural language because we're a bit scared of mushrooms. Like, we're a mycophobic society, which is the sort of phrase that a few people have used. But I mean, that's kind of one small corner, but I do think it's recoverable, but I think soon it won't be. And it's a life's work to know that stuff. Like, it can't be done quickly. You have to commit to it, and you have to keep returning and returning, and you have to find a way to pass it on too. It's really, I think it's vital, though. I really do.
Yeah, that's so, and it reminds me of another. Somewhere in the book you talk about your boy, and you say it strikes me that the difference between letting Bert run around here, which was a wood you're talking about, or in a soft play center, lies in the depth of the information that's contained in a wood. And there's history and memory and the biology of an entire life cycle all encoded in one space. And everything that you're talking about sort of made me think of that. And I wonder, have you read, and if you haven't, you absolutely must, Bewilderment by Richard Powers?
I have not yet, and I am very curious about it because the son is autistic in it, I think. Is that right? Or is it inside?
It's never he's neurodivergent. It's never clear exactly what it is, or what, but it is I mean, it's just a drop dead beautiful book.
He's a beautiful writer.
Oh my God. We could spend another hour talking about Richard
Let's just talk about Richard Powers.
But the narrator who's the boy's father is an astrophysicist, and it starts with the two of them in the Smoky Mountains and walking up hills and identifying exactly what you were talking about, fauna and flora, and the boy becomes completely obsessed with, like, and exactly as you were doing with the mushrooms, he does that with birds, and will sort of and learns and it consumes vast amounts of knowledge.
That's what we do.
And it's a wonderful book. I mean, it will devastate you, but it's a really fantastic book. I was just curious if you've read it. So.
No, I hadn't, and actually, like, kind of deliberately, because there's this huge wariness that I feel around books that deal with neurodiversity in fiction, because they've so often been horribly inaccurate. And I've kind of read around this and thought, it sounds okay, but I've been fooled before. So yeah, it's so tricky, but I will believe your recommendation now. It's really nice that I've been asking everyone if they've read it, and I've not actually come across another person that's read it yet, so
Yeah,
I feel a bit better about it now.
It is wonderful. And it's Richard Powers, so
I know,
and
I trust him.
Well, I do too. I trust him completely, and he's just an extraordinary human being. But he wrote one of my favorite books ever called "The Time of Our Singing,"
Okay,
which is just amazing. And I don't believe that he is a musician, but you would never know that he wasn't a musician, because he writes the sort of his ability to consume vast amounts of information and then put it into his novels in a way that sounds like you trust him, incredibly knowledgeable, and just like he's got the vocab, and it all sounds just perfect. So
I have to read that one too now.
Yeah. Oh God. I mean, we could do book recommendations. Well, I mean, I do own a bookstore, so I should probably ask you, and sorry for not giving you advance notice of this. What have you read lately that you've
really a lot of books on mushrooms. I mean, a lot of books on mushrooms. But also, in addition to that, I'm currently reading George Orwell's Roses by Rebecca Solnit, which is so beautifully done, I think. And just full of really dazzling ideas. Like, it's not a straight biography, and the way she's approaching Orwell as a concept, like more than as a person almost. It's really, I think it's great. And I've just started Lauren Groff's Matrix as well.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good. My wife's listening to it at the moment.
Writing.
I mean, she just it's outrageous that Lauren Groff can get away with that stuff. I mean, she's so incredible. She could do anything. But if you go, I thought I might write a novel about an 11th century nun.
I know.
But it's brilliant. And you just since we're talking about books, you did this great list for LitHub, and you mentioned Rebecca Solnit, who and her book on walking is fabulous. And you also mentioned Cheryl Strayed.
Yes.
And it's funny that because on about page 18 of your book, I wrote in the margin, "Wild this is not."
Yes.
Because of this kind of, you talk about you were creating the minor, what were we talking about for minor crises, but she was like just going all in and just doing the whole thing. So it's a very different.
I was actually reading Wild as I started the walk.
Oh, were you?
And so in lots of ways it kind of informed the book, but because I absolutely love it. But it was also like my story is the opposite. It's like the inverse of this,
absolutely.
And I almost knew at the beginning that walk needed to fail, that I couldn't complete the walk, and that I was not going to write that heroic narrative, because I just know myself. I knew it was never going to get done somehow.
That was what I loved about it. I loved it, and just like, which yeah, sorry if we spoiled the ending for anybody there. But
I don't think it's a plot spoiler. The denouement is in how I solved the problem.
Good point. And my wife actually, she's an English professor, and she actually taught a class on walking. And one of the ones that I was going through her shelves, and I was trying to find a couple, but this is one called Writers on Walking. I don't know if you've ever seen this one.
Oh, lovely. No, I don't have that one.
Duncan Minshall,
Beneath
My Feet. And then this one I loved, A Time for Gifts by Patrick. This is a classic. Have you read this?
Yeah. I love his books. I love Manny. That's one of my favorite books. I think he's extraordinary.
Yeah, the most self-possessed 17-year-old in the history of All right. Well, I'm afraid I've taken you slightly over what I had promised, but thank you so much, Katherine. It's been such a joy, as always, to talk with you. Thank you.
It's been lovely.
Beautiful, beautiful book, The Electricity of Every Living Thing. We love to do these events. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the conversation, please do consider buying a copy of this book from Skylark. Again, it's on the website. You can give us a call at 573-777-6990, or you can email us at mail@skylarkbookshop.com. Katherine, thank you again. It's been such a joy, and hopefully speak to you soon.
Yeah, next book.
Next book. There you go. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.